Hi everyone, it's Paul from This Design That. Today we're going to be comparing lab scanning with drum scanning and also DIY scanning. We're also going to be stress testing these scanning techniques, and we're going to be printing in A1 format each of the scans, and we'll see if the resolution holds up for even something like DIY scanning. First, let's go over each of the scanning techniques. First of all, I've got the DIY scanning. So I'm using this camera that I'm recording with. This is the Panasonic Lumix G85, and I've also got the Olympus 60mm macro lens. This is a dedicated macro lens, and it's one of the sharpest macro lenses, if not the sharpest, on micro four thirds. So luckily I've got a very good lens for doing this type of DIY scanning. The lab scan was done at AG Photographic, and this is the company that I use in the UK for all of my developing and scanning, and they use an Aritsu scanner for their medium format. And lastly, the drum scan. This is done by Tim Parkin at drumscanning.co.uk, and he uses a Heidelberg Prime Scan. Now, I'm sure most of you watching this, you probably know that drum scanning is considered the pinnacle of scanning in terms of the quality and the resolution. It's going to be really interesting to compare this with the other two cheaper alternatives, and let's see if really the cost is justified with drum scanning. So anyway, let's take a closer look at each of the scans now. Okay, let's first put the three raw scans side by side. The DIY scan, it doesn't have a raw scan, it's just a single exported file after some tweaks in Negative Lab Pro. Now pause it here and see if you can guess which is the drum scan. In my opinion, it's pretty easy to tell, especially when you look at the processed images. So if you didn't guess, it's the one on the right. I'm just going to go between the raw and processed images a bit, just to show you how much you can push the film. The drum scan definitely holds more detail out of the three, which is to be expected really. Resolution wise, obviously the drum scan, it just completely blows the other two scans out of the water. On the long edge, the drum scan is a whopping 13,500 pixels, and it's got a file size of 978 megabyte. Let's take a look at some crop sections of the images. Both the drum and the lab scan have a good amount of image data to be able to bring out most of the detail, but I do think the drum scan reveals quite a bit more when you look at the processed images. I was actually surprised how well the DIY scan performed against the lab scan. It shows about the same amount of detail in the edges of the picture. When we get closer, you can really see how much detail the drum scan is able to capture. For instance, you can really see the detail in the bark much more clearly in the drum scan. Let's compare the same area but with the DIY scan and the lab scan. There is a bit more brightness in the image, but the sharpness is pretty close. I think if I tweaked the DIY scan a little bit more, I could probably get it looking more similar to the lab scan, but you got to consider the amount of time that you're taking editing the pictures. And I think if I had to choose between doing DIY or lab for an entire roll of film, I would probably choose the lab just purely from the amount of time saved. It does take quite a while tweaking in Negative Lab Pro, and I still haven't really got used to it. Looking at another section of the image, we'll now compare the raw and processed again. If you take a closer look here, you can see how good the drum scan is here. It picks up all those tiny leaves and details. And if I really start to analyse this section, I feel that the trunk, it appears more lifelike. It's got a certain depth to it because you can pick up much more of how the light is interacting with the trunk. You have more shadow detail, which helps to make it not look like just a flat, solid block of black, which you can see in the lab scan here. I think overall, this aspect of the drum scan, it does add a certain depth to the image when I'm looking at the entire thing. And I don't think that can be recreated with the other scans. Moving on to the DIY versus the lab scan, I think here the lab scan does a better job. The DIY is just a little softer here. And just for the sake of it, let's compare the DIY scan to the drum scan. Moving on to the center of the image. Now there isn't much between the lab and DIY. I can just pick up more details in the hair of the lady walking, and the tree trunks have better shadow details. The quality of the DIY scan, it seems to have decreased in the center here. I'd probably guess that the negative is not entirely flat, and this is one of the problems with this type of scanning, and it's why drum scanning is ideal, because the negative is in constant contact with the drum. So after looking at all of the scans on the computer, I think it's fair to say that the drum scan has the most amount of detail. It does look a little bit different, and it does have a slight magenta cast on it, which I do need to tweak when it comes to the final image. So for example, if you look at this dirt section here on the drum scan, it's got a very strong magenta cast to it. And if you compare it to the lab scan and also the DIY scan, the DIY has got a little bit more of a blue cast. I would probably say the lab scan's got the most accurate color of this section down here. So it does need to be tweaked. The drum scan isn't perfect. I really feel that when I'm looking at all of these images, this one has the most amount of depth to it. You really feel like, you know, this person is walking through this pathway. What is also really interesting is, this is just my personal opinion, and I did actually show all of these images to my family, and I asked them two questions. First of all, what they felt was the most expensive scan, and also what was the image that they just personally preferred. If they were going to have this up on a wall, what one would they choose? Now my brother amazingly got it right. He doesn't know anything about photography. He did guess that this one was the drum scan and this one was the DIY scan. My girlfriend as well, she got it right. I would kind of expect her to, because she's around me doing all of this type of stuff. But the rest of my family actually guessed it the complete opposite. They thought this was the most expensive and they thought this was the cheapest. And then when I asked them what one did they personally prefer, most chose this one. They kind of felt it was in the middle of these two scans. And I can see what they're talking about. I would say this one, maybe it needs a little bit of tweaking. Maybe it's got so much detail, it almost doesn't look real. And I think that if you're looking at something maybe a little bit more like this, it feels a bit more like a photograph. It's hard to explain. I mean, I do personally prefer this one. As I said, I like the depth to it, and I like the amount of detail, and I like all of the tiny nuances of light that it's picked up coming through all of the leaves. This was kind of like sunset time, and the sun was over here and it was kind of projecting this light through here. And I feel that this one has probably captured that a little bit better. So it just goes to show, drum scan isn't going to just magically make your picture better than other types of scans. But what I'm really interested in here is the resolution. And if you needed to print something big, you know, would you have to use a drum scan? Honestly, even from this distance that I'm standing, which is an arm's length away, it's very difficult to see any sort of issues with resolution with any of them. I mean, even the DIY scan, well actually the lab scan was the smallest resolution. And from here, I can't see any issues with resolution. I can't see any blockiness. It's only when I start getting really up close that I can notice the softness. I can notice some of the blockiness in here, and here as well I can see some of the blockiness. But honestly, from the normal viewing distance, which would probably be a good few meters away if you was looking at a picture this kind of size, I don't think you would really notice. And I think this is a really good example of how, you know, you can really push the enlargement of images. And I've seen various different other YouTube videos that have shown this. You know, you can take a picture with a 35mm film and you can blow it up. Photoshop does a really good job at enlarging and keeping the pixels the same when you're enlarging things. So is drum scanning worth the cost? Now, it is 7 times as expensive as the lab scan. I think that if I had a picture that I really loved, and I really love this picture, then I would go with the drum scan, because I do feel that even though this edit maybe isn't kind of how I want it to look in the final image, I do feel that it has captured the most amount of light, and I do really like how it does add a certain lifelike feel to the image. And for that reason, and the fact you get, the resolution and the file size that you can work with is amazing. I mean, fair enough, at A1, you don't see any sort of problems with the resolution. But if I wanted to print this bigger, you would start to see the resolution issues in this image. And because I wanted to push this as much as I could, I've doubled these prints once more. So this is essentially 2 A1s. The drum scan, it still just looks perfectly normal. DIY scan and the lab scan, they're really starting to look quite blocky. This section here is looking not very nice, and also kind of the details on the hair is starting to kind of like break apart a little bit. So once you're printing this size, it is needed a drum scan, I feel. But you got to remember, think of the size of the image. The image is going to be 2 A1s. It's going to be massive. So I think only at that point would you need a drum scan. So hopefully that's given you some sort of insight into drum scanning. I will probably be using drum scanning in the future for my favorite images. As I said, I think just kind of keeping them archived in the best possible quality is the way forward. If I ever really want to print it big, I can always kind of pull that scan and I know that I've got the best possible image. For just normal rolls of films that I'm just kind of running off and I want to see the images, I would probably go with lab scan, because lab scanning is pretty cheap. I mean, it's £4 or £5 additional cost to the price of development. Really, that does save me quite a lot of time compared to doing it DIY. If I was doing a roll of 120, you've got 10 shots, a roll of 35 would be even longer. I would probably only use DIY scanning if maybe I knew that 1 or 2 shots were messed up or something happened with the exposures, and I knew it probably weren't worth exposing a whole roll of film. I have actually been pleasantly surprised with the DIY scanning. It works. The images look pretty good and they don't look that much worse than a lab scan in some cases, and you could probably even get even better results here. As I said, we did see some softness in the middle of the image, and that was probably because the negative was not perfectly flat. There are ways to work around that. You can use anti-Newton ring glass. You can place that on top. You can even do wet scanning as well to make sure that the negative is nice and flat. And I do think that would probably solve a lot of the issues, and it'd make the sharpness even better with the DIY scanning. So anyway, let me know your thoughts. If you've got any really nice drum scans you want to share, put them in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you all later.